imagine reaching into your medicine cabinet for something totally routine, a pain reliever, something you've probably taken hundreds of times. You trust it, right? It's just always there. But what if that simple action, that simple pill, suddenly carried this unthinkable fatal risk?
It's a really terrifying thought, isn't it? That a product meant to help could actually become, well, deadly.
Absolutely. And that chilling reality actually happened back in 1982, mostly centered around the Chicago area during what we now call the Tylenol murders.
Yeah. And this wasn't just some, local tragedy. It was a massive event, really, that fundamentally changed consumer safety as we know it.
Totally. So we've pulled together a whole stack of sources for this deep dive: articles, research, firsthand accounts detailing what happened, the investigation, the fallout.
Right.
And our mission here, specifically for you listening, is to kind of give you the shortcut through all that material. We want to unpack this really pivotal moment, understand exactly what went down, who was involved, or at least suspected, how it forced huge changes in business and law, and why it still resonates so strongly today. Let's just jump right in.
Okay. So the timeline, it began really suddenly. September 29th, 1982. A series of just baffling deaths started popping up in the Chicago suburbs.
Yeah, it started that morning with Mary Kellerman. She was just 12 years old. Woke up with a sore throat, runny nose, the usual stuff.
Yeah.
Took an extra-strength Tylenol capsule.
Wow.
And by 7 a.m., she was gone.
Just like that. Then, later that same day, you had Adam Janus, 27, a postal worker. He collapsed, died after taking Tylenol for some chest pain he was having.
And initially they thought maybe a heart attack.
Exactly. Initially baffling. But then, this is where it gets even more horrific. As the family gathered to mourn Adam, his brother Stanley, who was 25, and Stanley's wife Teresa, just 19.
Oh, no.
They both took Tylenol capsules from the exact same bottle that Adam had used.
You're kidding.
No.
Yeah.
And they also died within days.
Can you imagine that bottle sitting right there, something you trust, and it's actively killing your family members?
It's almost unspeakable. And the pattern, it just kept going. Over the next few days, 3 more victims. Mary McCarland, 35, Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, tragically found in her Chicago apartment, and Mary Weiner, or Reiner, sources vary, 27, a new mother.
So that brought the total to 7 deaths.
7 deaths, yeah.
7 people, seemingly healthy, just dying suddenly after taking this common pain reliever. The confusion must have been just immense. How did anyone even begin to connect the dots?
Well, it was incredibly tough at first, but there was a critical moment when investigators, health officials, including this really sharp nurse, Helen Jensen, they noticed a pattern, a link to Tylenol. And crucially, in some of the bottles they recovered, they noticed capsules were missing.
Missing capsules, which led them to the awful discovery, right? It wasn't just that they were missing, they'd been replaced.
Exactly. The Tylenol powder inside those capsules, it had been emptied out and replaced with a highly potent poison, potassium cyanide. Some sources say sodium cyanide, but either way, extremely lethal. A tiny amount was enough.
And when you say tiny, we're talking really tiny. I read that each capsule had enough poison to kill thousands of people in like 50 milligrams, that's barely anything, was enough for almost immediate death.
Yeah, it's hard to even comprehend. So the scale of the potential threat, once they understood it, just triggered immediate, widespread panic.
Oh, I bet. Once that link was confirmed, poisoned Tylenol warnings were literally blaring from police cars in Chicago neighborhoods.
What?
People were told, throw out your Tylenol.
Yeah.
The fear was so intense, I read some towns even canceled Halloween trick-or-treating that year.
Wow. Yeah, that shows you how deep the fear ran. And you have to remember Tylenol's position back then. This wasn't some minor product.
No, it was huge.
It was the #1 best-selling non-prescription pain reliever in the U.S. Controlled something like over 35% of the market. Huge moneymaker for Johnson & Johnson, the parent company.
And the capsules were popular, right? Easy to swallow.
Exactly. That was a big part of its appeal. So this wasn't just an attack on a product. It was like an attack on this deeply trusted brand, something in millions of homes.
So how did Johnson & Johnson react? You've got the CEO, James Burke, David Collins. How did they handle this absolute nightmare?
Well, their response is actually now, studied in business schools. It's seen as a classic example of really effective crisis management. They moved incredibly fast.
They didn't try to minimize it or deflect blame?
No, not at all. They immediately took responsibility for the product's safety, even though, they obviously weren't responsible for the tampering itself, notified the FDA instantly.
Okay.
And then came this really unprecedented step. Mass warnings nationwide through all media and a voluntary recall. Over 31 million bottles of Tylenol pulled from shelves and homes.
31 million bottles. The cost must have been astronomical.
It's estimated around $240 million back then, which was just massive. But they didn't stop there. Halted all Tylenol production, all advertising. Offered replacement capsules for people who had bought it. And they put up a $100,000 reward for information leading to the killer.
And they set up those 1-800 hotlines too, right? One for consumers, another just for the media with daily updates.
Yep. And the CEO, James Burke, he went on major TV shows like 60 Minutes.
It was the thinking behind that level of, openness and such drastic action.
It seemed to be a very deliberate decision. Prioritize public safety above everything else and communicate that relentlessly.
Okay.
By being so transparent, so proactive, so clearly concerned for people's well-being, they kind of managed to shift the narrative. They positioned J&J not as the company whose product killed people, but as another victim of the crime.
Right, alongside the public.
Exactly. And that trust-first approach was absolutely key to them eventually recovering the brand.
So while the company's fighting to save its reputation and protect the public, the police are in this frantic race against time. What was their main theory about how this happened?
Well, their working hypothesis, based on where the tainted bottles were found, different stores, different batches, and the nature of the tampering, was that it happened after the Tylenol left the factory.
Okay, so not at the manufacturing plant.
Right. The thinking was someone, or maybe multiple people, were taking bottles off store shelves, probably in the Chicago area, opening them up, lacing the capsules with cyanide, and then putting the poison bottles back on the shelves for unsuspecting customers to buy.
So targeted retail-level tampering. Chilling.
Exactly. And the hunt for that person or persons was incredibly intense. But, despite this massive investigation, spanning decades, hundreds of leads, the person who actually committed the murders has never been definitively found or charged.
It's such a deeply unsettling part of this story. The person directly responsible for those 7 deaths got away with it.
It is.
So who was the main person they looked at? The primary suspect?
That would definitely be James Lewis. He kind of burst onto the scene, not because they immediately linked him to the poison, but because he sent an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson.
Oh, the letter. He claimed he was the killer.
Yeah, claimed responsibility and demanded $1 million to make the killing stop.
Wow.
Investigators tracked him down pretty quickly, found him in New York City.
Did he confess to the murders then?
No. He vehemently denied actually committing the poisonings. He stuck to that story his whole life. But he did admit writing the extortion letter.
Why? What was his reason for the letter, if not the murders?
His claim was pretty bizarre. He said he wanted to embarrass his wife's former employer by having the reward money sent to their bank account.
That seems like a very strange and indirect motive for something so serious. Did the investigators buy his denial of the murders?
Well, he remained a prime suspect for decades. And what's particularly disturbing is that he apparently gave investigators these really detailed scenarios about how the crime could have been pulled off. Yeah, almost like he was consulting with them, comparing it to analytical work he might do for a, corporate client. It was quite chilling. He even gave DNA samples to the FBI much later, in 2010.
And he had some history with the law already, didn't he? It wasn't like he had a clean slate.
No, definitely not. His background was troubled. He'd faced a dismemberment murder charge years earlier, though it was dismissed. He had a mail fraud conviction. And later, even faced rape and kidnapping charges, also eventually dismissed. But yeah, it certainly didn't paint a picture of innocence.
So Lewis was convicted for the extortion letter, served about 13 years of a 20-year sentence, got out in 95. And he maintained his denial right up until he died.
Right up until his death in July 2023 at age 76. His death was ruled non-suspicious.
So he died without ever being charged for the actual murders. That must leave such a difficult feeling, especially for the families and people involved back then.
Absolutely. Helen Jensen, the nurse who helped make that critical initial connection to Tylenol, she expressed hope that maybe Lewis's death would bring some kind of closure, even if it wasn't the conviction everyone really wanted.
I remember reading her thoughts. She felt Lewis, quote, changed the world, and that because of this whole event, we lost our innocence. Called him a terrorist who basically held people in fear for decades.
Yeah. And for the victims' families, like Monica Janus, she's related to Adam, Stanley, and Teresa Janus, the frustration is still incredibly raw. She's talked about feeling the initial investigation was, in her words, really sloppy.
Understandable.
And just remains deeply frustrated by the fact that there's never been real accountability for those 7 deaths.
It's just a profound thought. This crime that had such a massive impact remains, at its core, unsolved. But even without catching the killer, the Tylenol murders forced these huge fundamental shifts in how we deal with consumer products now.
Oh, absolutely. The most obvious change, the one we see every day, is tamper-proof packaging. Or, more accurately, tamper-evident packaging.
Right. Stuff we just totally take for granted now. Those seals and wraps. Before 1982, that just wasn't the norm, was it? Especially not for pill bottles.
Not at all. And Johnson & Johnson actually led the charge here. They invested reportedly over $100 million to completely redesign their Tylenol packaging.
What did they introduce?
They brought in what they called triple safety seals. So you had the glued box flaps, then a plastic neck seal around the bottle cap, and a foil seal over the bottle's mouth. Plus, big warnings on the box telling people, check the seals before using.
And that multi-layered approach, it just became the standard, right? Pretty quickly.
Yeah, it rapidly became the industry standard for basically all over-the-counter medicines. You see variations of it on almost everything you buy now.
And it wasn't just the packaging, right? The products themselves sometimes changed.
That's right. A lot of companies shifted away from those easy-to-open gelatin capsules, the kind you could just pull apart relatively easily.
Yeah.
They moved towards solid caplets, which are basically tablets coated to look like capsules, or just regular solid tablets, much harder to tamper with undetectably.
So the container changed. And the form of the medicine inside often changed too, to be less vulnerable. And this whole tragedy also directly led to new laws.
It absolutely did. The crisis really pushed Congress to act. In 1983, they passed what became known as the Tylenol Bill.
Making tampering a federal crime.
Exactly. Made tampering with consumer products a serious federal felony.
And the FDA stepped in with regulations too.
Yep. A bit later, in 1989, the FDA established specific federal rules requiring tamper-resistant packaging for over-the-counter drugs. They even got specific, like requiring at least 2 tamper-evident features for things like those hard gelatin capsules.
It's also worth remembering this wasn't just, a one-off scare that faded. The Tylenol murders unfortunately sparked copycat incidents, didn't they, in the years after?
Sadly, yes. There were incidents involving other medications, even things like baby food, I think Girl Scout cookies at one point. It sort of exposed this vulnerability people hadn't really thought about before.
And the fear spread, even internationally.
Yeah, tampering wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon after that. It showed how widespread that fear and maybe the idea for perpetrators became.
So that little moment of annoyance maybe you feel today when you're wrestling with multiple seals, peeling off foil just to get to your allergy meds or whatever, that's a direct result, a tangible consequence of the 1982 Tylenol murders and the urgent steps taken afterward to try and keep consumers safe.
It really is.
So looking back at this whole deep dive, the legacy of the 1982 Tylenol murders is just undeniable, isn't it? A horrific crime, technically unsolved in terms of the perpetrator being convicted.
Right.
But it absolutely forced these fundamental sweeping changes in product packaging regulation.
It profoundly reshaped consumer safety, forced a whole rethinking of trust in brands, trust in the everyday things we bring into our homes. The human cost was just devastating. And that really unsettling fact remains. The person responsible for those initial awful deaths was never truly brought to justice.
It really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? 40 plus years later, how does an event like this still shape how we perceive safety today? The trust we put in companies and regulatory bodies, and maybe even just that quiet awareness of, the hidden vulnerabilities that might exist in our seemingly secure everyday lives.
Yeah, and think about that balance we strike, maybe without even realizing it, every time we buy something packaged today. That balance between convenience on one hand and security on the other. That balance was dramatically and, probably irrevocably reset by this tragedy.